Imagine a blazing inferno consuming everything in its path, yet one building stands untouched, its walls echoing with cries of faith that defy the flames. This is the story of a miracle you won't forget. Los Angeles was on the brink of devastation. A wildfire raged mercilessly, consuming homes, dreams, and hope itself. But amid the chaos, something extraordinary happened at the Grace of God Church, a moment so profound, it left witnesses questioning everything they thought they knew about miracles. Stay with me as we uncover this remarkable story of faith, unity, and survival. It began as an ordinary evening in Los Angeles, but nature had other plans. A spark turned into a blaze, and within hours, a wildfire of unprecedented ferocity tore through the city's outskirts. Fueled by dry winds and scorching temperatures, the fire showed no mercy, swallowing homes, businesses, and everything in its path. The skyline, once vibrant and alive, was now obscured by thick, choking smoke. For many, it felt like the end of the world. In the middle of this chaos stood the Grace of God Church, a modest building nestled in a quiet neighborhood. Its weathered walls had witnessed countless sermons, weddings, and moments of solace, but now it faced an unimaginable threat. The fire was advancing, fast and unstoppable. Entire blocks had already been reduced to ash, and the church stood directly in its path. Evacuation orders had been issued, and the streets were eerily empty, except for the brave firefighters battling the inferno. Inside the church, the scene was one of mounting tension. Hundreds of people, both congregation members and those seeking refuge, had gathered. Some clung to their loved ones, their faces etched with fear, while others stared blankly at the walls, unable to process the reality of their situation. The air was thick with anxiety, and every distant crackle of the flames felt like a countdown to their doom. Pastor Jonathan, the church's leader, stood at the altar, his heart heavy with the weight of responsibility. He knew his role wasn't just to lead prayers, it was to offer hope in the face of despair. But even he couldn't ignore the reality outside. The fire was less than a mile away, and every passing moment brought it closer. There was no guarantee they would be spared. The tension was palpable. Conversations were hushed, filled with fearful questions. Will the fire reach us? Should we leave? What if it's already too late? The answers were uncertain, and that uncertainty bred panic. A mother clutched her two young children tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers. An elderly man sat silently, his hands trembling as he fiddled with his rosary. The sheer helplessness in the room was overwhelming. Adding to the turmoil was the challenge of evacuation. The roads leading out of the neighborhood were blocked or consumed by flames, and emergency services had advised everyone to stay put. For many, it felt like a cruel waiting game, watching helplessly as the fire marched closer. The church had become both a sanctuary and a trap. Pastor Jonathan scanned the room, feeling the weight of every fearful gaze turned toward him. He knew he had to act to give his people something to cling to in their darkest hour. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and raised his hands to quiet the murmurs. "Listen to me," he began, his voice steady but firm. "I know you're scared. I am too. But this is not the time to give in to fear. This is the time to hold on to our faith." The congregation looked to him, their expressions a mix of hope and doubt. "We may not be able to control what's happening outside," Pastor Jonathan continued, "but we can control what happens here, in our hearts. Together we can pray. Together we can ask for protection, for strength, and for a miracle." His words hung in the air, and for a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, a few heads nodded. A young woman in the front row clasped her hands and began to pray softly. Others followed, their murmurs growing louder. The fear that had gripped the room began to shift, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of determination. But outside, the fire continued its relentless advance. Flames crept closer, licking at the edges of the churchyard. The heat was unbearable, and the orange glow of the fire cast eerie shadows inside the sanctuary. Time was running out, and everyone inside knew it. The question lingered in every mind: would their prayers be enough to save them, or would the fire claim yet another victim? Inside the church, the scene was surreal. Hundreds of people filled the pews, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and hope. Parents clutched their children tightly, while elders whispered prayers with trembling hands. The sound of crackling fire outside was growing louder, a constant reminder of the impending danger. Each gust of wind carried the acrid smell of smoke, seeping through the cracks of the old wooden doors. Pastor Jonathan, though visibly shaken, stood at the altar. His calm demeanor was like a lifeline for the terrified congregation. He cleared his throat, his voice steady, yet imbued with urgency. "Listen to me," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "We are facing a fire that no man can stop, but our faith is stronger than anything this world can throw at us. If we stand together in prayer, we will not face this alone." At first, the crowd was hesitant. A few murmurs of uncertainty rippled through the room, but Pastor Jonathan refused to give in to doubt. He closed his eyes and raised his hands to the heavens. "God is with us even now. Let your voices rise to Him. Call out with all your heart." Slowly, one voice joined his, then another, until a wave of prayer began to roll through the room. It wasn't timid, it was bold, unfiltered, and raw. "Allahu Akbar," someone cried, and soon the chant grew louder, filling every corner of the church. The phrase meaning, "God is great," transcended religious boundaries in that moment. It became a universal expression of surrender, hope, and unity. Meanwhile, outside, the fire's relentless advance seemed unstoppable. The air was thick with heat, and embers floated like fireflies in the darkened sky. Firefighters worked tirelessly, dousing nearby structures in water, but they couldn't help noticing the church. From their vantage point, the building stood like an unyielding fortress, its walls illuminated by the eerie glow of the encroaching flames. Among the firefighters was Harry, a newcomer to the city and to the team. She was a pragmatist, someone who believed in action over faith. Yet, something about the church drew her gaze. "What are they doing in there?" she asked her captain, gesturing toward the glowing windows. Her captain shook his head. "Praying, I guess. It's not going to help them now." But Harry wasn't so sure. Against her better judgment, she put down her hose and approached the church. As she pushed open the heavy doors, the scene inside stopped her in her tracks. The congregation was no longer a group of individuals. It was a single, unified force. Their voices reverberated off the high ceilings, creating a symphony of faith that seemed to push back against the fear and despair. Harry's heart raced. She had grown up in a world where miracles were fairy tales, and faith was a distant concept. Yet here she was, standing in a room that felt charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Tears welled up in her eyes as she watched people, strangers, hold hands and cry out together, their faces illuminated by flickering candlelight. Outside, something extraordinary began to happen. The fire, which had been racing toward the church, seemed to falter. Witnesses later described it as if an unseen hand had drawn a line in the sand. The flames licked the ground mere feet from the building, but did not advance further. Firefighters stood frozen, their hoses slack, as they watched the inexplicable scene unfold. Harry, overwhelmed, found herself kneeling on the floor. "What is this?" she whispered to no one in particular. A woman beside her placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "This is faith. This is the power of prayer." As the congregation's cries continued, the atmosphere in the church shifted. Fear gave way to peace. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a sanctuary, a place where the intangible became tangible. People who had never spoken to each other before held hands, their voices blending into one harmonious plea for deliverance. For Harry, the skeptic, it was a moment of transformation. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in her life, she felt connected to something far greater than herself. And she wasn't alone. Every firefighter, every passerby who paused to witness the scene, was touched in some way. The church, illuminated by faith rather than fire, stood as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The fire, a roaring beast, consuming everything in its path, reached the churchyard. Flames licked the edges of the property, dancing wildly against the wind, as if taunting the tiny sanctuary that stood in its way. The air was suffocatingly hot, thick with smoke, and the acrid smell of burning wood and earth. It seemed inevitable that the Grace of God Church, like so many other structures, would fall victim to the inferno. Inside, the prayers reached a crescendo. Pastor Jonathan's voice rose above the crowd, firm and unyielding. "Do not falter," he urged. "God is with us. Let your faith be louder than the flames." The congregation obeyed, their voices roaring together in defiance of the fire. "Allahu Akbar! God is great!" The words echoed like thunder, shaking the rafters of the old church. Outside, the firefighters stood stunned. The flames, which had been surging forward with unstoppable force, suddenly halted. The fire seemed to hit an invisible wall, its ferocity dampened, as though a barrier had been placed around the churchyard. Embers fell harmlessly to the ground, and the blazing heat receded just enough for the firefighters to approach closer. One of them, an older man with decades of experience, muttered under his breath, This doesn't make any sense." He wasn't alone in his disbelief. The fire, which had consumed entire blocks in minutes, now appeared to swirl around the church without touching it. Witnesses described the scene as if the flames were bowing, respecting an unspoken boundary they could not cross. Inside the church, the intensity of the prayers peaked. People were no longer crying in fear, but in awe. The atmosphere shifted dramatically, from one of desperation to one of overwhelming peace. It was as if an unseen presence had wrapped the building and everyone inside it in a protective embrace. Harry, the young firefighter who had stepped inside moments before, stood rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the stained glass windows. The colorful panels glowed with an almost otherworldly light, the flames outside illuminating the figures of angels and saints. She felt something stir deep within her, a warmth that was neither from the fire nor the crowded room. It was something she couldn't name, but knew she would never forget. And then came the moment that left everyone speechless. A sudden, powerful gust of wind swept through the area. The flames, which had been circling the church, were pushed back as if guided by an invisible hand. The fiery wall surrounding the building broke apart, retreating further and further until the church was completely clear. Outside, firefighters scrambled to make sense of what they were seeing. One of them dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "It's a miracle," he whispered. Harry, still inside, felt the change too. The suffocating heat was gone, replaced by a cool breeze that swept through the open doors of the church. She looked around and saw the faces of the congregation, their expressions shifting from fear to astonishment. Pastor Jonathan, now kneeling at the altar, looked up with tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Lord," he said softly, his voice cracking with emotion. As the flames retreated into the distance, the congregation erupted into cheers. Strangers embraced, families wept tears of relief, and the once somber church now echoed with joyous cries. The church bell, long silent, suddenly rang out, its clear tone cutting through the night, as if proclaiming victory over the fire. Outside, those who had gathered to watch the fire's approach stood in stunned silence. They had expected to see a tragedy, but instead, they witnessed something extraordinary. Word spread quickly, and soon reporters, neighbors, and even those who had fled the area returned to see the church standing untouched amidst the charred remains of the surrounding landscape. Harry stepped outside, her heart pounding. She looked at her fellow firefighters, who were equally dumbfounded. One of them approached her and said, "You were in there. What happened?" Harry could only shake her head, tears in her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I just saw something bigger than all of us." The church, standing tall and unscathed, became a beacon in the darkness. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a symbol of hope, faith, and the unexplainable power of unity in the face of disaster. In the aftermath, the Grace of God Church stood as a symbol of hope and unity. News of the miracle spread far and wide, inspiring countless others to find strength in faith during their darkest hours. For Pastor Jonathan and his congregation, it was a reminder that in the face of disaster, unity and prayer can create a force no flame can conquer. The Los Angeles wildfire left a trail of destruction, but amidst the ashes stood a beacon of resilience, a story of faith that will be told for generations. If this story moved you as much as it did us, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more incredible and inspiring stories like this one. Your support helps us keep sharing these powerful moments with the world.